and there are surges of cases in many places at the moment. What is whooping cough?
Well, as you just said, it's really uncomfortable to listen to, isn't it? And it is an unusual cough. It's not like one of those viral coughs that you get and you feel a bit rubbish for a couple of days and it goes away. It's caused by a bacteria called Bordetella pertussis. And these bacteria, they actually attach to a bit of the airways, the throat, the mouth, for example, and they attach to these tiny little projections that we have in our airways that are like hair, and they normally kind of waft away all the gunk that we don't want, all the bugs that we don't want in our mucus and our phlegm. And instead what happens is this bacteria attaches to these hair-like things, very important things, and then releases a poison that stops them working. So then people get all this mucus that they find hard to shift, and then their airways get swollen, and that's what causes this cough, these spasms of cough, and it can be hard to breathe, and that's why you often hear that whoop or that whoop, and it can feel really uncomfortable. People can get these sort of uncontrollable spasms of coughing, particularly they start at night, then they can carry on into the day. But little babies may not get that whooping sound or whooping sound and actually just stop breathing, and it can cause all horrible complications too.
Yeah, how dangerous is it? Because anyone can get it, can't they?
Anyone can get it. Adults can get it, teenagers can get it, older people can get it, but it is most dangerous in young babies. Because they're much more likely to struggle to breathe. That lack of oxygen when they're not breathing can even result in brain damage. They often get pneumonia and infection deeper into the lungs, and it's normally in babies that you see fatalities, also in people who've got immune systems that aren't working as well, for example. But anyone can get it, and particularly in pregnancy too, people have got to watch out, because you want to make sure that you don't get it then and get unwell then.
And it's normal to see this surge in cases every few years, but are these bigger surges than usual, and where are we seeing them?
You do see cases surge every 3 to 5 years, like you say, and there is a concern right now that there might be more cases than we usually see. We're seeing cases in Europe, in Asia, at the moment, for example, in China, there's been 32,000 cases in the first couple of months this year and 13 deaths. There's been cases in China, kind of similar numbers for a few years now, and experts are quite worried about that. In Europe, we've seen 60,000 cases last year, and then this has continued into this year with 32,000 cases already in the first 3 months of this year. Particularly, in fact, in Europe, the Czech Republic is seeing quite a lot of cases, 6,000 just in the first 4 months of this year. And people are quite worried that this might be higher than at other times.
But many people are vaccinated against it, so why the surge?
Lots of people are vaccinated, but it has to be said that in some parts of Europe and the UK as well, and other parts of the world, vaccines rates are a bit lower than we'd expect, because maybe partly because of the COVID pandemic, that children didn't get all their routine vaccinations, and routine vaccinations have fallen a bit in children, so that's probably having an impact. But then also, people not just through the vaccine get some protection, but also through pertussis or whooping cough just being around in the community, and people get a bit of boost of their immunity by coming across it. And experts are saying, well, actually during COVID no one really interacted with each other, and so there was less chance of getting that natural immunity too. And then there's also the case that your immunity does wane. Yes, the vaccine does help, but as you get older that immunity gets less.
Is there anything then that individuals can do to protect themselves against it?
The most important thing is to make sure that babies, children are vaccinated, because the point is of the vaccine is to protect the people who are most vulnerable against getting really ill from it. So making sure that people are vaccinated, and if you're older and you haven't had your vaccine, many countries are saying you can go and get it. If you're pregnant, if you get a vaccine, it actually can protect your baby as well for the first couple of months, when it can't protect itself, when it can't have a vaccine of its own. If you do get it, rest, fluids, hydration, keep away from other people if you can, and antibiotics. antibiotics can help, particularly in the first 3 weeks, to clear some of that bacteria from your throat and your mouth and your nose, so that when you cough, you're not as contagious. They might not always help with symptoms, but they can help to stop you spreading it to other people.
Thanks, Smita. Now, people in Southeast Asia are living through what some are calling an historic heatwave at the moment. Meanwhile, it's been found that in the Northern Hemisphere, last summer was the hottest in 2,000 years. This week, The Lancet published a report for Europe called The Countdown on Health and Climate Change, which shows how deaths caused by high temperatures have increased over the past 2 decades. And they found that women are twice as likely to die as men. So I spoke to Dr. Modi Motsama, who is Head of Capacity and Field Development for Climate and Health at the Wellcome Trust. And I asked her what high temperatures do to us.
So at a very basic level, we're all affected when we're exposed to heat. Our temperature goes up, we get a bit sweaty as our bodies pump blood to the extremes of our skin in order to cool down. Those are kind of physical manifestations we're seeing. But underneath that, our hearts have to work harder to get the blood from the core to the outside. There are groups of the population who are particularly vulnerable to excess impacts of heat on health, and those include pregnant women. Another vulnerable group are the very old and the very young, and particularly in elderly people who have underlying chronic conditions such as heart disease. Exposure to excess heat and the heat stress that results from their body exacerbates those conditions.
Now, one quite startling statistic is that twice as many women as men are dying from things that are linked with heat. Why is that? Is that just about pregnancy, or is there something else going on there as well with women?
Pregnancy is a big factor, but to be honest, there isn't very much science to understand those differences. We recognise that pregnant women are at risk, and we don't really fully understand the mechanisms why they're at risk and why we see an increase in adverse health outcomes in them. Most of the studies that looked at the effects of heat on health in people have largely been done in men, and particularly in male athletes, elite athletes. So there are still big gaps in our understanding of why these different groups are at risk, and in particular what the physiological mechanisms behind these risks are. So some of the research we're funding at the moment is aiming to understand some of those questions.
Well, in terms of what to do about it, how easy is it to get policymakers to take the impact of heat and climate on health seriously?
So we have a challenge at the moment in that there isn't very great understanding that heat waves do have an impact on people's health. So one of the things we need to do is really raise awareness of those risks through funding research to better understand those impacts. So for example, in the UK, a heat wave is described as 3 or more days above 25 degrees in Scotland, which is a bit cooler, or 3 or more consecutive days of temperatures above 28 degrees in London and the Midlands, which tend to be a little bit warmer. Those levels aren't considered a risk to most people. In fact, many people will actively choose to go on holiday to places where the temperature is around 28-30 degrees. But people don't really recognise that being exposed to higher temperatures than what is normal for where they live in has an impact on their health and is going to lead to increased adverse health outcomes.
There seems to be much more talk now about the impact that heat can have on our health. Is that because there's been lots more science about it and there's been lots of research, or is it something where awareness is rising and it's just getting talked about more?
That's a really good question. I think the science has always been there, but the issue wasn't talked about as much. And now we're getting to a situation where the scientists and specialist communities who have always known about these impacts of health are finally starting to break through to broader audiences, to really raise awareness that actually heat is a serious problem that needs to be taken seriously. So I think there's increased awareness, there's also increased funding and resources, and to not just provide more research and generate more evidence in this space, but then also to support those organisations who translate the evidence and turn it into messages for the general public to actually be better able to do that. It needs to attract more funding, but I think it's not that the science is new. It's just the fact that the translation of the science and communication of that science is improving, but we still do have a long way to go, especially in parts of the world where it's already quite hot. That awareness that excessive heat impacts health hasn't necessarily trickled down into policy action and priorities in many parts of the world, but also in places like Europe as well. There isn't still that understanding.
Modi Watsama. Smita, temperatures are going up in many parts of the world, aren't they, at the moment? I mean, there's a lot of places facing heat waves.
Southeast Asia, for example, right now it's grappling with a brutal heat wave, and it's been going on for 6 weeks or so. So traditionally a hot time of year for that part of the world, but I think people really are suffering in places like Cambodia, Philippines, Malaysia, Thailand, Bangladesh, parts of India, East India, Syria, Lebanon. In all of these places, the temperature has hit above 40 for some considerable time in the last few weeks.
Now, in the last week, there seem to have been lots of studies about heat that have come out, not just the European one that I mentioned.
One study that's come out just in the last couple of days in the journal Nature, researchers looked at tree rings to work out the that have been devastated, people where their animals are dying because of the heat. You see people sitting under tin roofs. In some of the countries I mentioned, there are huge refugee camps and active conflict, and you see people in those camps suffering beyond everything else they're going through with the heat as well. And yes, it definitely brings it home, and I think in all of those places, governments are being urged to come up with policies that can make sure that we adapt to that climate change, and that's difficult.
Yeah, a big task. Now, while I have you, I wanted to ask you about a new trial of a really clever alternative to injections for vaccinations, and it's kind of patch in a way. How does it work?
I really like this one. It's really nice to report on innovations and things improving, and this in particular is a little plaster, sticking plaster, that on it has these very, very, very tiny microscopic needles that are pretty much pain-free, that you stick on the skin. And in this trial, it delivered a measles and rubella vaccine to adults and children. Most of them didn't feel any pain. You stick the plaster on for 5 minutes and you take it off. And the trial's quite promising. So they looked at adults and 150 toddlers and 150 infants, or 140 so, and half of people were given the vaccines via this patch, and at the same time a syringe and needle delivering just a dummy vaccine, just some saline water really, and the other half were kind of switched around, where they had the patch giving just a dummy vaccine and the needle giving the traditional vaccine, and then they compared them to see, okay, does it work as well? And they found that one shot worked as well whether you gave the vaccine via the little sticky plaster patch or via the traditional route through the vaccine. And the side effects, yes, there was some itching and a bit of discoloration around where the patch was put on, but no major side effects that worried them. It is a small trial, but they think they're promising results.
And where was that done?
And this was done in the Gambia, and it was done by the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and it's in the Lancet. And the researchers are really excited because they hope that if they do larger trials involving a lot more children, not just healthy children, for example, malnourished children too will be very important, that this could really beat some of the real problems of getting vaccines to people who need them most, and that it's really hard to get them to, because you don't need to keep them in a fridge like you do in most vaccines. You don't need a needle and syringe, which can put people off a lot, particularly if they've got a serious needle phobia. You may not need as many trained health professionals. Perhaps you could even get to a point where you can put it on yourself, or a parent could put it on for you. So it's very exciting if it does work over larger trials.
Yeah, it's clever. Thanks for that, Smita. Now, for many months on Health Check, we've been following journalist Mike Powell through the ups and downs and long waits while he's been trying to get a kidney transplant. In March, he finally had the operation to receive the kidney donated by his friend. And when we last heard from him, he'd been worried about how well the new kidney was working. So I was wondering how it was getting on now.
Hello, Claudia. It's, as you know, 2.5 months since my kidney transplant. And my living donor, my old school friend who I met at the age of 11, is back in Ireland working like a Trojan with 1 kidney while I have 3. So the recent tests on my donor's implanted kidney have been really encouraging since the transplant. My latest kidney function increased from 37 to 43%, and levels of creatinine, a substance you don't want in excessive amounts in your body, fell 20 points, which is good. Before transplant, my kidney function was only 8%, which is actually termed as end-stage kidney failure. And since surgery, that number has been a bit of a roller coaster, but it seems to be stabilising now, thank God. I've been revisiting the hospital in Oxford, where I had the transplant in March, for regular checkups. And a couple of weeks ago, I had a stent removed from my urethra, which was inserted during the transplant surgery to connect my donor's kidney to my bladder. It only took a couple of minutes to remove it, although it did feel longer, and it was rather painful to pass urine for a bit afterwards with blood appearing for a while, but all is okay now. I've actually been back at work for 3 weeks now, which has been good if tiring. I was also concerned, of course, about travelling on busy trains and the notoriously packed London Underground, as I'm on immunosuppressants to stop my body rejecting the new organ. And as the name suggests, the drugs lower my immune system, so a transplant patient can be prone to picking up infections, really, including when someone's coughing or sneezing within close proximity. But so far, thank heavens, things have gone pretty okay. As a freelancer, I don't have the comfort of getting the UK statutory sick pay from my employer, so it's meant 2 months without any income. And I've heard that people in my position are really tempted to go back to work early, but after a year of build-up and a bumpy ride over the last few months, which you of course have been part of, I didn't want to risk the chance of being infected or overexerting myself for a bit of cash. This week I've had my last clinic in Oxford, and if things are still going well, I'll be discharged at the 3-month mark back to my local hospital for continuous monitoring. It seems like a milestone, but I'm sorry to say goodbye to the team at Oxford who have held my hand through the whole process. Hopefully things continue to improve, but either way, I'll update you in a month or 2 just to reassure anyone else who's considering going down the transplant path, either as a donor or recipient. It's a bumpy ride, of course, as I've said, but the results can be life-changing, helping many avoid debilitating dialysis. Sometimes modern medicine is truly amazing, and it's thanks to generous souls who donate their organs and the staff who make it all happen that make me forever grateful.
Mike Powell. Smita, it's good to hear it's going well, isn't it?
It really is amazing to hear that.
Now, before we go, depending on where in the world you live, you may have been lucky enough to see the Northern Lights over the weekend, which were visible in places in the US, Europe and New Zealand, often in areas where you could never normally expect to see them, like my street in London. Not that I succeeded in seeing them, but the ecstatic reactions of the people who did seem to be a perfect example of awe, a topic which has been studied in psychology for its relationship with well-being. So I asked Catherine Loveday, who's Professor of Cognitive Neuroscience at the University of Westminster, whether, like so many people I know, she saw the light show.
I did. I saw them on Friday night and I got some fantastic photos of them. And I was showing them to a couple of friends of mine the next day, and they were so excited that we thought it was going to happen again. So we organised to go to this country park near me, which is quite high up, and I thought, this is great. No one knows about this spot. It's really high up. It'd be fantastic. And we got there, and I have never seen so many cars. This secret place of mine was absolutely packed with everybody, and of course we didn't see anything at the time.
So you'd taken people up there and they didn't see anything?
Yeah.
Well, at least you saw them on Friday. I didn't see them at all, and I've been trying all weekend since then. But looking at everyone's reactions, it does seem like a perfect example of the experience of awe. And awe has been a topic of psychological research, hasn't it? It's something you can measure.
Yeah, and there is this evidence now that it is quite a distinct emotion with distinct facial expressions and sounds, and that it's quite universal. We can see it across different cultures, and also that you can see it in children as well.
And it's often the vastness of space or the sea or the impressive height of trees that seem to induce the feeling, or the northern lights. Is experiencing all good for us?
Absolutely it is. There's so much evidence now that it can boost well-being, and actually you can measure this on a physiological basis so that you can see changes in things like our inflammatory markers, which we know is a sign of stress, and they tend to go down when we experience awe. And it helps us to be more present, which we know is good for us, and there is just great evidence that it makes people feel happier and better in themselves.
And there seems to be something about it that helps us put things into perspective and almost makes you feel as if in the grand scheme of things, what you're worrying about might not matter so much. And over the years I've interviewed quite a few astronauts, and have often told me the same story, which is that say they go up to the space station, they're allowed to take a tiny package of their own stuff with them, so they can take, say, 2 books, and that they never open their books because they hardly get any spare time. But when they do have spare time, they want to spend it staring out the window and looking back at Earth. This is sometimes called the overview effect, and that they get this whole new perspective on the world by looking back at Earth and seeing how fragile it is. And I'm wondering if something like the Northern Lights, it's a less extreme version of that in a way. We're seeing something kind of bigger than us out there.
Yeah, and I suppose just the surprise of it, and the fact that light can do that just in our sky, in our back garden, is incredible. But there are other things that can produce awe. So we know that, for example, things like acts of courage and kindness can make us feel awe, and obviously things like religious and spiritual occasions, music, visual art, even births and deaths. So there's lots of ways in which we can understand and experience awe.
And if, like me, you've failed several nights running to see the Northern Lights, and you don't live in the north of Scotland where you might have a chance to see them every few months, can we find awe in simpler ways?
Yeah, I think just walking around in nature, and this was something we've seen in some of our memory research, that people can get an absolute wonder just by seeing a tree come out into blossom, or seeing sort of a leaf that's got lots of detail on it. There's many different levels in which we can see it in our very immediate environment.
Catherine Loveday. Smita, are you going to tell me you saw them too, and it's just me that missed them?
I didn't see them, and I am so upset that I didn't see them, because I feel like I've been taunted by friends sending me photos of these beautiful lights. In fact, not far from where I live. But the problem is I have small kids, and it was a choice between waking them up and having grumpy kids for the rest of the night and going to see them and trying to see them, or just sitting there looking out my window sad, which is what I chose to do.
Yes, you see, I could have seen them, but managed to forget to see them at the right moment, and then tried again and again without any luck at all. When was the last time, though, that you'd say you experienced awe?
Oh, that is a good question. I don't know if this is allowed, but the other day my 4-year-old was reading.
Oh, that's allowed. Yes, it can be people.
It was just so cool to see that he'd figured out what all the letters meant and was actually reading sentences. And even more awe-inspiring was that his big sister was helping him, and I just thought, well, this is just beautiful. How does the human brain work like this? 1 minute he's this tiny little thing that can't do anything for himself, and now he's actually reading whole words.
Oh, that is so lovely. What about you? Maybe the week before, I went to Italy and I went to Pompeii, and I've never been to Pompeii before, which is obviously the town that was preserved after Vesuvius erupted. And it's absolutely extraordinary. I don't know if you've been, but it's absolutely extraordinary. And that gave me all just the fact that it was found and what happened to those poor people. And the things that what really struck awe in me was the loaves of bread. There are at least 81 I saw loaves of bread that have been preserved.
Still there?
Yes, they've been preserved by the lava flow. Really amazing.
Yeah, that really is amazing. Wow.
Well, thank you for coming in, BBC Health reporter Smita Mundasan, and do visit the Health Check studio again. Today's producer was Margaret Cessa Hawkins. Our studio managers were Emily Preston and Donald McDonald. I'm Claudia Hammond, and if there's a health topic you're particularly interested in, do remember that if you look online, there are hundreds of earlier episodes of Health Check where you might find just what you're looking for. I'll be back on the BBC World Service at the same time next week. Do join me if you can.
This is the BBC World Service. Investigating why South Africans are taking matters into their own hands when it comes to fighting crime.
South Africa's murder rate is at a 20-year high. We joined 2 volunteer patrols who say they have no choice but to defend themselves.
We are ready to die for our community.
Crime and punishment in South Africa at bbcworldservice.com/documentaries or wherever you get your BBC podcasts. In 60 minutes, from our own correspondent.
The non-smoker who died of lung cancer, the child's mystery cough that came back. Now that Thailand knows what's causing deadly air pollution in Chiang Mai, is there any sign that the government will do something about it?
This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Hi, I'm JM. I'm a musician from the UK, and in 2021 I was diagnosed with ADHD. I'm one of millions living with a label, but where do these mental health labels come from?
The notion that we needed some sort of classification for mental disorders goes back a long way in medical history, but the relevant history starts in the 19th century in the United States when the superintendents of asylums realized that they needed some way of recording who their patients were.
It's a theory or like a proposal of a condition that is brought to a committee. It is a group of psychiatrists who decide which diagnoses are categorized in this manual.
When I was a younger psychiatrist and as a trainee, as a resident, I had to learn the DSM by heart. We had to apply it so that we could pass our exams.
That's the documentary, Labelling the World, The Power of DSM, straight after the news from the BBC World Service.
I'm Stuart McIntosh with the BBC News. Hello. A member of Israel's war cabinet has accused the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of leading the country towards an abyss because of his refusal to draw up a post-war plan for the Gaza Strip. In the latest sign of division at the heart of the government, Benny Gantz made a series of demands, as our correspondent in Jerusalem, Paul Adams, explains.
If the government does not adopt a 6-point plan that he spelled out within the next 3 weeks, then he will lead his party out of the ruling government. That plan that he outlined included a plan to defeat Hamas, to bring hostages home, to create some kind of mechanism for the future governance of the Gaza Strip, and a number of other conditions. I think the point worth remembering about this is that he is not in a position to bring the government down, provided Mr. Netanyahu can retain the support of the far right.
Tens of thousands of Israelis have been taking part in the latest protest in Tel Aviv to demand that the government secure the release of all the hostages still being held by Hamas. Relatives of those who were abducted on October the 7th called for an immediate ceasefire. In one part of the city, police used water cannon to disperse anti-government protesters. This woman was there.
First of all, I want everyone to come back, all the 132 hostages to come back. That's why I'm here, that's why I've been on the streets since October 7th. And we need election, we need to change our government. Our Prime Minister can't be your Prime Minister.
The head of the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees says more than 800,000 people have been forced to flee Rafah in southern Gaza due to the ongoing Israeli offensive. Philippe Lazzarini said all were having to do so without safe passage to areas with little water or sanitation. Donald Trump has addressed thousands of gun owners in Texas, pledging to roll back any controls introduced by President Biden if he wins November's election. The politically powerful National Rifle Association is closely aligned with the Republican Party in opposing firearm restrictions. Mr. Trump said the Democrats would take away the constitutional right to bear arms.
If they get in, our country is going to be destroyed in so many ways, but the Second Amendment will be, it's under siege. But with me, they never get anywhere, and we need that Second Amendment for safety, forgetting about even going hunting and all of the things that you do. We need it for safety. If the Biden regime gets 4 more years, they are coming for your guns, 100% certain.
President Biden has repeatedly called for a long-lapsed ban on assault weapons to be reinstated. This is the World News from the BBC. Further bad weather is hampering rescue efforts in the Brazilian state of Rio Grande do Sul, where record floods have left huge areas underwater. In the 3 weeks since the storms first hit, heavy rains have caused rivers and lakes to overflow, killing at least 151 people. The candidate chosen by an opposition coalition in Venezuela has promised that all political parties would be allowed to operate freely if he beats President Nicolas Maduro in July's election. Edmundo Gonzalez addressed supporters in his hometown, La Victoria. He urged them to imagine a country in which the president did not see his adversaries as enemies. The mayor of the capital of New Caledonia has said the French Pacific territory is under siege after nearly a week of unrest prompted by changes to voting rights. Sonia Lagarde said the city of Noumea remained far from calm. 6 people have been killed since the trouble began. Hundreds of heavily armed French security personnel are patrolling the streets. The Ukrainian boxer Alexander Usyk has become the first undisputed world heavyweight champion in a quarter of a century. He beat Tyson Fury of Britain in a fiercely competitive contest in the Saudi capital, Riyadh, which went the entire 12 rounds. Fury, who is taller and heavier than Usyk, went into the match as the slight favourite. He'll take the bulk of the total prize money, which is to exceed $100 million, despite losing. Fury spoke after the fight.
I thank Alexander for the good fight. I believed that I thought I did enough, but I was a judge. It was what it was. I'm not going to cry about so much. I've had plenty of victories and I gave God the glory. I've had this one loss, a close fight, you know, with a good man like Usyk. And it was what it was. I tried my best in there. I was having a lot of fun actually.
And that is the BBC News.
Hi, I'm Jen, a classical musician based in Birmingham in the UK. I play the cello, and in 2021, during the pandemic, I was diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD. I'd felt for some time that something wasn't quite right, and I struggled to get a diagnosis. But when I finally did, I began to research not just ADHD, but also mental health more generally. I wanted to understand how terms like ADHD had come about, their origins and history. In the process, I came across a book called The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or DSM for short. Written in America and followed worldwide, it's often referred to as the Psychiatrist's Bible, and for the past 72 years has been used to define and explain mental disorders. It began with just over 100 diagnoses, and now there are nearly 300. I'm JM, and over the next hour, this is the documentary, Labelling the World, the Power of DSM, from the BBC World Service. You might not have heard of the DSM manual, but its influence on all our lives is huge.
I think DSM is part of our day-to-day work in Hong Kong.
Ever since DSM-3 became so popular from its very first day of publication in 1980, and every subsequent DSM, a massive bestseller, selling many more copies than there were clinicians, and being bought by patients as well. It became a party game, diagnosing yourself, diagnosing other people.
I think we use the DSM in Singapore as a book to guide the classification of mental health conditions. Sometimes people describe the DSM as the Bible for psychiatrists, right?
The DSM is published by the American Psychiatric Association, known as the APA. First established in 1844, the APA is the main professional organisation for psychiatrists and trainee psychiatrists in the United States, and the largest psychiatric organisation in the world with 38,000 members. The APA publishes various journals and books, but by far the most influential is the DSM. It's available in 19 different languages, and purchasing a copy of the DSM-5 today would set you back up to $170, though there are various versions which will cost you less. The manual started life as a short book, like a pamphlet, in 1952. Now it's a massive tome which anyone would struggle to carry around with them. But what is the DSM for? Well, the original intention was to create a reference point and a common language for psychiatrists.
Really what it is a way for all the physicians to kind of have a way of communicating with each other. So it sort of standardizes things for us, makes things a little easier, so that if you go to practitioner 1, 2, 3, 4, wherever you go, they follow the criteria. So it doesn't matter who does the evaluation, the results should be the same. And that's really the goal across the board.
The notion that we needed some sort of classification for mental disorders goes back a long way in medical history, but the relevant history starts in the 19th century in the United States, when the superintendents of asylums for people with mental illness realized that they needed some way of recording who their patients were and beginning to assemble information regarding the potential causes of the conditions that their patients had. The result was a series of idiosyncratic diagnostic systems that sprang